In that dirt courtyard, under the cold morning sun, a black boy knelt before the master. His hands were clasped together as if holding his own life between his fingers. He had no weapons, no protection, and no one to defend him. Only faith. He believed that if he pleaded with sincerity, perhaps he would find a remnant of compassion. But the master didn't see a child. He saw property. He laughed at the plea, laughed at the fragility, and laughed at the idea that this boy could ever deserve mercy. For him, it was just another moment to reaffirm his power, his authority, and his absolute dominion. But that morning, something impossible happened. While the cruel laughter echoed, the air became strange. The dogs, always attentive to orders, grew restless. The workers stopped without understanding why. The boy raised his eyes, not to the master, but beyond him, as if he had heard an invisible call. Within minutes, the plantation would witness something that would defy all logic of the era, an event that could not be explained. It would become a forbidden story, something that would place the master before the only fear he never imagined feeling: losing control. That boy, kneeling in the dirt, would be the first to rise against the destiny that had been imposed upon him. And his faith would be the force that triggered the greatest reversal that plantation had ever seen. Willowbrook Plantation was located in southern Georgia, one of those immense properties that stretched for miles of cotton fields, weathered wooden fences, and cramped cabins where dozens of people lived without dignity. The year was 1856, a time when cruelty had a name, surname, and registered address. There, Mr. Thaddeus Harrove reigned as a small but absolute monarch over his lands, and over the lives he considered his property. He was a middle-aged man, with a protruding belly, a thick mustache, and eyes that never showed doubt. For Thaddeus, questioning his authority was like questioning the natural order of the world. He firmly believed he had been born to command, and that others had been born to obey. This conviction, fed by generations of impunity and privilege, made him not just an oppressor, but someone who took pride in it. The boy kneeling before him was named Samuel. He was only 12 years old, but his eyes carried a forced maturity that only suffering can sculpt. Samuel had been born there, the son of Martha, a quiet woman who worked in the big house and who had learned early to keep her head down and her mouth shut. Samuel's father had been sold when he was only 4 years old. And since then, the only memory he kept was a deep voice singing at night, a melody his mother sometimes repeated in whispers. Samuel grew up between the fields and the slave quarters, quickly learning that survival required invisibility. Being noticed meant trouble. Being remembered meant punishment. But that morning, he had no way to escape the master's attention. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to comment which city you're listening from and subscribe to the channel. Let's strengthen our community together. Thank you. And now, let's get back to the story. It had all started 2 days earlier, when Samuel was accused of stealing food from the pantry. The accusation came from Jacob, the overseer, a black man who had been placed in a supervisory position over the other workers. Jacob was feared and hated in equal measure. He had learned that the only way to maintain his small privilege was to be more cruel than the master himself, constantly proving his loyalty through brutality. When Jacob found a piece of bread hidden under Samuel's straw mattress, he didn't hesitate. He dragged the boy by the arm to the big house, shouting accusations that everyone knew were true. Samuel had stolen because his mother was sick, because that week's food ration had been even smaller than normal, and because hunger had stopped being a discomfort to become physical agony. But explanations didn't matter. Theft was theft, and Thaddeus Harrove did not tolerate insubordination. That cold November morning, Everyone on the plantation was summoned to the central courtyard. It was standard procedure for public punishments. Thaddeus believed that examples served to maintain order. He wanted everyone to see what happened to those who dared defy him, even if the defiance was just the desperate need to eat. The workers gathered in a semicircle, tired faces turned downward. No one wanting to witness, but all forced to be there. Martha was among them, hands clutching an old cloth, lips moving in silent prayers. Samuel was brought to the center, pushed by Jacob, who maintained a hard expression, as if he needed to prove to himself that he felt nothing. Thaddeus slowly descended the porch steps, savoring the moment. He carried a whip rolled in his right hand, but he didn't intend to use it yet. First, there was the ritual of verbal humiliation, the moment when he could demonstrate his power, not just through force, but through words. He approached Samuel and stopped right in front of him, forcing the boy to raise his eyes. Samuel tried to maintain his composure, but fear was visible in the trembling of his lips. Thaddeus smiled, that predatory smile of someone who knows victory is already guaranteed. He began to speak loudly so everyone could hear, about ingratitude, about how he provided shelter and food, about how he was repaid with theft and dishonesty. Each word was a knife designed to wound not just Samuel, but everyone present, to remind them of their place. That's when Samuel did something unexpected, perhaps influenced by the stories his mother told at night. Stories about a God who saw the oppressed and heard their prayers, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose, or perhaps because, even at 12 years old, he had already understood that dying on your feet was better than living on your knees. Samuel knelt, but not in complete surrender. He clasped his hands together and began to speak. His voice was weak at first, but gained strength. He wasn't asking Thaddeus for forgiveness. He was asking God. He was praying out loud, right there in front of everyone, begging for divine mercy, for justice, for liberation. He spoke about hunger, about pain, about his sick mother, and about the injustice of it all. His words broke the script Thaddeus had expected. He wasn't a slave passively accepting punishment. He was a boy claiming humanity, claiming connection to something greater than the master's earthly power. Thaddeus was disconcerted for a moment. Then came anger. How dare that boy? How dare he invoke God, as if he had the right to do so? The master began to laugh, a loud and cruel laugh that cut through the morning air. He called Samuel a fool, an idiot, a stupid child who believed in fairy tales. He said that God, if he existed, certainly didn't care about slaves. He said that prayers didn't fill bellies or break chains. He said that the only authority that mattered there was his. Thaddeus Herove, master of those lands and of all lives within them. The laughter spread. Jacob laughed too, forced, trying to maintain the mask. Some of the white overseers watching from the porch joined their laughter to the master's. It was a chorus of mockery designed to crush any remnant of hope. But while Thaddeus laughed, something began to happen. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The dogs that always roamed the property, animals trained to be aggressive and obedient, began to act strangely. They stopped walking, fixed their eyes toward the tree line surrounding the plantation, and began to whimper softly. One of them, a large mastiff that was Thaddeus's favorite for intimidating workers, lay down on the ground and covered its muzzle with its paws, as if trying to hide from something. Thaddeus stopped laughing and looked at the animals, frowning. Jacob also noticed and took a few steps back, confused. The workers began to whisper among themselves, looking around, trying to understand what was happening. The air changed. " It's difficult to describe exactly how, but everyone there felt it. The temperature seemed to have dropped a few degrees, but it wasn't just cold. It was a feeling of weight, as if the atmosphere had become denser. The wind, which had been blowing gently before, stopped completely. The leaves on the trees became motionless. Even the birds that always sang at dawn fell silent. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. Samuel, still kneeling, raised his eyes, not to Thaddeus but upward to the sky. His face changed. Fear gave way to something different, an expression of strange peace, almost transcendental. He stopped trembling. His hands, previously clenched tightly, relaxed, and then he began to smile. It wasn't a smile of mockery or defiance. It was a smile of relief, as if he had just received an answer to his prayer. Thaddeus saw that smile and felt something he wasn't accustomed to feeling. A shiver ran down his spine. He took a step back involuntarily. Something was wrong, but he couldn't identify what. He tried to regain control of the situation, shouting for Jacob to bring cold water, saying the sun was affecting the boy, looking for any rational explanation for that strange behavior. But his voice came out less firm than he intended. The workers also felt the change. Martha, Samuel's mother, covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of despair. They were of something more complex, a mixture of fear and hope that she couldn't name. Then it happened. Out of nowhere, or at least that's how it seemed, a sound began. Low, deep, coming from the earth or the sky, no one could say. It was like a hum, but also like distant thunder, but also like voices murmuring in unknown languages. The sound grew, became louder, more present, until everyone could feel it vibrating in their chests. The workers looked at each other, frightened. Some began to back away. Jacob dropped the whip he was holding and searched for Thaddeus with his eyes, expecting an order, an explanation, anything. But Thaddeus was paralyzed, looking at Samuel with an expression that mixed disbelief and, for the first time in his life, genuine terror. Samuel stood up. He wasn't forced. No one helped him. He simply rose as if an invisible force had pulled him upward. He stood before Thaddeus, and for the first time, it was the master who seemed small. The boy looked directly into the eyes of the man who had humiliated him, and there was no anger in his gaze. There was only a frightening clarity, a certainty that seemed to come from a place far beyond his 12 years. When Samuel spoke, his voice was no longer that of a frightened child. It was calm, firm, loaded with an authority no one could explain. He said that Thaddeus had been weighed and found wanting. He said that cruelty had a price, and that price would be collected. He said that oppression couldn't last forever, because there was a justice greater than the laws of men. And then he said something that made everyone's blood run coldy. He said that at that exact moment, freedom was on its way. Thaddeus tried to laugh again, but the sound came out strangled. He opened his mouth to give a sarcastic response, to recover his power through mockery. But before he could pronounce a word, they heard it horse hooves. Many horses, coming down the main road leading to the plantation. The sound was unmistakable, an intense, urgent gallop. Everyone turned their heads toward the gate. Jacob ran to the fence to get a better look and went pale. He shouted something unintelligible and came running back. Thaddeus, still trying to process what was happening, walked to where he could have a view of the road, and felt his legs weaken. A group of about 20 men on horseback was approaching rapidly. But they weren't ordinary men. They were federal soldiers. Blue uniforms, unmistakable even at a distance, armed and organized. At the front rode a man carrying rolled papers in one hand. Behind the soldiers, there was a closed carriage and 2 more riders who appeared to be officers of some kind. This wasn't a social visit. It was an official operation. Thaddeus felt the ground disappear from under his feet. His mind tried to process, tried to find an explanation, a reason for that sudden presence. There was no reason. He hadn't done anything that justified federal attention. Or had he? The soldiers entered through the main gate, without asking permission. The lead officer dismounted with precise movements and walked directly toward Thaddeus, who was still in the middle of the courtyard. Samuel remained standing, motionless, observing everything with that same serene expression. The workers moved aside, forming a natural corridor between the soldiers and the master. The officer stopped a few meters from Thaddeus, removed his hat in minimal courtesy, and unrolled one of the papers he carried. Without any elaborate introduction, he began to read. It was a search and seizure order issued by the federal government, authorizing the investigation of Thaddeus Harov's property for accusations of illegal trafficking of people, violation of importation laws, and possession of smuggled individuals after the prohibition of the Atlantic slave trade. The words fell like lead. Thaddeus tried to protest, said it was absurd, a misunderstanding, that he had never smuggled anyone. But his voice failed in the middle of the lie, because it was a lie. 3 years earlier, Thaddeus had actually purchased a group of people who had been brought illegally from Cuba in a secret operation that several Southern planters used to circumvent federal laws. He had believed he was safe, that no one would discover it, that the distance from Washington and local complicity would protect him. But someone had talked. Someone had reported him. And now there was the consequence. The officer didn't wait for answers. He signaled to his men, who immediately began to spread throughout the property. Some entered the big house. Others went to the slave quarters. Still others began to search the barns. Thaddeus tried to follow the soldiers who entered his house, shouting about his rights, about private property, but was politely blocked by 2 soldiers who made it clear he shouldn't interfere. Jacob tried to flee discreetly, realizing that his position as overseer could make him an accomplice, but was intercepted before reaching the trees. The workers watched everything in silence, barely able to believe what they were seeing. The world they knew, with its cruel but predictable rules, was being turned upside down right before their eyes. Samuel didn't move. He continued standing in the same place observing. Martha managed to approach him, gently pulling his arm, but the boy seemed to be in a trance. She whispered his name, asked if he was okay, but Samuel only nodded slowly. He looked at her and said something that Martha would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said he had asked for help, and that help had arrived. He said that God had heard and answered. Martha didn't know if she believed it, didn't know how to process it, but she hugged her son tightly, feeling that something impossible was really happening. Inside the big house, the soldiers found documents, records that Thaddeus had kept hidden, proof of illegal trade, receipts for payments to smugglers, correspondence with other planters involved in the scheme. They also found a secret basement where some people were still imprisoned, recently arrived from a clandestine crossing, waiting to be distributed among different properties. The discovery was devastating. The officer returned to the courtyard with a stack of papers and informed Thaddeus that he was being arrested on federal charges. The property would be temporarily confiscated while the investigation continued. Thaddeus fell to his knees, not in prayer like Samuel had done, but in complete despair. Everything he had worked for, the entire small empire he had built through cruelty and exploitation, was crumbling in a matter of minutes. But the story didn't end there. While Thaddeus was being led away in chains, ironically experiencing for the first time the feeling of being another's property, the soldiers began to explain what would happen to the people on the plantation. There was a federal program still experimental and full of problems, but existing. That offered resettlement for individuals freed from illegal situations. It wasn't full freedom, not the way it should have been, but it was a beginning. Some would be taken to colonies in the north. Others would receive documentation identifying them as free, at least on paper. It was confusing, imperfect, but it was infinitely better than what they had before. The workers took time to understand. Some cried. Others remained silent, processing. Still others showed fear, because freedom was a word they had never been permitted to imagine. And the unknown frightens as much as known oppression. Martha held Samuel tighter, realizing that her son's world would be different from hers. That perhaps, just perhaps, he would have a chance she never had. Samuel remained calm, that strange serenity still present on his face. When one of the soldiers passed by him, the boy thanked him. The soldier seemed confused, asked why he was thanking him. Samuel simply said he had prayed for help, and that it had arrived exactly when he needed it. The soldier, a middle-aged man who had seen a lot in life, looked at that 12-year-old boy and felt something strange. He wasn't religious, didn't believe in miracles. But the synchronization of events was disturbing. The search order had been issued 3 weeks earlier, based on an anonymous tip that had reached the federal office. The operation had been carefully planned, waiting for the right moment. But by pure coincidence, they had decided to execute it exactly that morning. By pure coincidence, they had arrived exactly at that moment, seconds after the boy made his public prayer. The soldier couldn't explain it. It could be chance. Probably was. But there was something in the absolute certainty in Samuel's gaze that made him question. In the following weeks, the story of what happened that morning spread to neighboring plantations. Some said Samuel had powers. Others said it was just luck, an extraordinary but explainable coincidence. Still others, particularly those who had an interest in keeping the system running, tried to suppress the account, saying it was dangerous to let that kind of story circulate because it gave hope, and hope was the enemy of established order. But stories like that have a life of their own. They spread by word of mouth, are told at night when no one else can hear, are whispered as reminders that the impossible sometimes happens. Martha and Samuel were resettled in a small community in Tennessee, a place where freed people tried to rebuild their lives with minimal resources and constant hostility. Life didn't become easy. Legal freedom didn't mean equality, didn't mean opportunity, didn't mean absence of racism or violence. Samuel grew up facing the same prejudices, the same barriers, the same structural injustices that existed throughout the South. But he grew up free. He grew up with a name that was his, with choices he could make, with a future that wasn't entirely defined by another man's whim. And he grew up with unshakable faith. He always told the story of that morning, of how he had knelt and prayed, and how minutes later the answer had arrived in the form of horses and blue uniforms. When Samuel became an adult, he became a preacher. Not in large churches, but in small gatherings, in homes, in barns. Anywhere people came together to find comfort and strength. He spoke about that morning as testimony, that prayers were heard, that injustice couldn't last forever, that there was a greater order than human systems of oppression. Some listened to him with skepticism, others with desperate hope, but everyone remembered. The story was powerful, not because it definitively proved something, but because it offered a different narrative, a possibility that the impossible could break into reality. Thaddeus Harrove was tried and convicted. He lost everything. He died a few years later, bitter and alone, never admitting he had done anything wrong, always blaming conspiracies and invisible enemies for his downfall. But some nights in the last years of his life, when he was alone and drunk, he would tell strangers in taverns about that morning, about the boy who had prayed and the soldiers who had arrived. He didn't admit it was anything more than coincidence. But there was something in his tone of voice that suggested doubt. As if deep down, something in him recognized that he had witnessed something he couldn't fully explain. Jacob, the overseer, had a different fate. Initially arrested along with Thaddeus, but since the evidence against him was lesser, he was released after a few months. He tried to rebuild his life, but his reputation followed him. No community of free people accepted him, seeing him as a traitor. No white planter trusted him, seeing him as part of the problem that had brought down Harrove. He ended up wandering, doing temporary work, never finding a place. Years later, some say he sought out Samuel, wanting to ask forgiveness. Others say he died without ever acknowledging the evil he had done. The truth was lost, like so many truths from that era. Willowbrook Plantation was eventually divided and sold. None of the people who lived there as slaves received an inch of that land. That's the part of the story that has no impossible reversal, the part that follows the cruel and predictable logic of injustice. But the land holds memory. Even today, more than a century and a half later, there are those who say that in that specific location where Samuel knelt, the earth is different. They say nothing grows there, as if the ground had absorbed so much suffering that it refuses to produce. They also say that on certain November mornings, when fog covers the fields, it's possible to hear voices' prayers, whispers of faith that persist, even when everyone who uttered them has long since gone. The question about what really happened that morning remains. Was it divine? Was it coincidence? Was it the combination of a timely anonymous tip, efficient military planning, and unbelievable timing? The answer depends on who you ask. For rationalists, it's clearly a case of extraordinary luck, where several independent events converged in a dramatic but explainable way. For Samuel and those who believed him, it was tangible proof that there exists a justice that transcends human systems, that prayers are heard, that the impossible can happen when faith meets the right moment. But perhaps the real lesson isn't in definitively deciding between these interpretations. Perhaps it's in recognizing what that moment represented for everyone who witnessed it. It represented the breaking of normality, the interruption of the script of oppression that seemed inevitable. It represented a fissure in the system, a moment when power that seemed absolute was revealed as fragile. Thaddeus believed he was invincible, that his authority was unquestionable, that he could laugh at a boy's prayers because nothing and no one could challenge him. In 10 minutes, that illusion was completely destroyed, not just by soldiers or federal laws, but by the living demonstration that systems of oppression, however entrenched they may seem, can crumble. Samuel's story resonates through time because it touches something fundamental about human experience. All of us, at some point, find ourselves before powers that seem invincible. We all face situations where injustice seems to have the last word, where cruelty seems to be the natural order of things. And in those moments, we need to decide whether we're going to passively accept or whether we're going to, like Samuel, kneel and make our prayer, our protest, our request for something better. The impossible happened for Samuel, not just because soldiers arrived, but because he had the courage to believe it could happen. That belief, that refusal to accept cruelty as final destiny, is in itself a form of resistance. The generations following Samuel faced their own battles. Slavery was abolished, but freedom was limited. Segregation was institutionalized. Civil rights were denied, and then won through decades of bloody struggle. Each generation had its own Thaddeus Harovs, its own systems of oppression, its own cruelties that seemed unbreakable. And each generation had its own Samuels, people who knelt not in submission but in faith, who prayed not for easy miracles, but for justice, who believed that the impossible could happen. The story that began with a boy kneeling in a dirt courtyard is, in the end, a story about the power of hope against overwhelming evidence. It's a story about how faith, whether in God or in justice, or simply in the possibility of change, can be the most revolutionary thing we possess. Thaddeus laughed because he couldn't imagine a world where his authority was questioned. Samuel prayed because he could imagine a different world, even though he had never seen one. And in the tension between these two visions, between the cruel cynicism of the oppressor and the persistent hope of the oppressed, something impossible had spaced to happen. The 10 minutes that separated Thaddeus's laughter from the soldier's arrival were, for everyone present, an eternity. They were the time necessary for certainties to be questioned, for the world to show it was larger and more complex than any human system tried to contain it. They were the time necessary for Samuel to transform in everyone's eyes from a terrified child into a symbol of resistance. Not because he had powers, not because he was special in a supernatural sense, but because he refused to accept the narrative that had been imposed upon him. He refused to believe that his oppressor's cruel laughter was the last word about his life. And perhaps, in the end, that's the impossible that really happened. Not just the coincidence of the soldier's arrival, but the internal transformation of a child who decided, even facing probable death, to believe in something better. That transformation, that refusal to be defined by another's cruelty, is the true miracle. It's the kind of miracle that can't be explained just by coincidence or timing, because it happens in the internal space of human courage. In that place where we choose to resist, even when resisting seems futile. Samuel's story reminds us that systems of oppression depend on our belief in their inevitability. They maintain themselves because they convince us there's no alternative, that established power is permanent, that prayers are useless and hope is naivety. But the truth that morning revealed is that these systems are more fragile than they appear. They're maintained by forced consensus, by shared terror, by collective acceptance that nothing can change. When one person, even if just a child, breaks that consensus and acts as if a different world were possible, they create a fissure. And through those fissures, the impossible can begin to happen. Today, when we visit the places where these stories happened, it's easy to look at the past and condemn it. It's easy to see Thaddeus Harov as a monster from another era, as if cruelty were a solved problem, something that remained in the 19th century. But the uncomfortable truth is that the same patterns persist. The tools have changed, the justifications have been updated, but the essence remains. There are still people who laugh at the prayers of the vulnerable, who consider some human beings less worthy than others, who build their fortunes and power on others' suffering. And there are still Samuels, people who kneel and pray and believe, against all evidence, that the impossible can happen. The lesson isn't that we should simply wait for miracles. The lesson is that we must create the conditions for the impossible to have somewhere to happen. The soldiers didn't appear out of nowhere. They appeared because someone reported, because there were federal laws that could be applied, because there existed, even if imperfect, a legal structure that could be used against oppression. The miracle wasn't just the soldiers' arrival, but the combination of Samuel's faith with the actions of anonymous people who worked to create tools of justice. It was the intersection between prayer and denunciation, between faith and law, between the impossible and the practical. Samuel lived to be 72 years old. He never became rich, never became famous outside of small circles, but he raised a family, had children and grandchildren, and saw generations who never knew chains. Whenever he told the story of that morning, he ended it the same way. He said, "The impossible had happened not because he was special, but because in that moment he refused to accept the possible. He refused to believe that Thaddeus's cruelty was the end of his story. And in that refusal, in that stubborn faith in something better, he opened space for the impossible to become real. The story ends where it began, in that dirt courtyard. But it ends transformed. The boy who knelt in terror and faith rose in freedom. The master who laughed in cruelty fell in ruin. And everyone who witnessed carried with them the memory that the impossible, sometimes when we least expect it, breaks into reality and changes everything. That memory, passed from generation to generation, is in itself a form of resistance. It's a reminder that no system of oppression is permanent, no cruelty is inevitable, and no prayer for justice is truly ignored. Even when it takes 10 minutes, or 10 years, or 10 generations to be answered. The years after the impossible, the years that followed Samuel's liberation, were marked by constant struggle and adaptation. The community in Tennessee where he and Martha settled was composed of other freed families. People who had escaped bondage through various means. Some legal, some not. They built their homes with their own hands, rough structures that leaked when it rained, but that represented something profound, shelter that belonged to them. Samuel worked in various trades, from carpentry to fieldwork, always for wages, always with the knowledge that he could leave if he chose. That simple freedom, the ability to say no, to walk away, to negotiating, was something he never took for granted. He saw how other men his age, men who had been born free, treated these rights as ordinary. For Samuel, they remained miraculous, even decades after that morning in the courtyard. Martha lived another 15 years after their resettlement, long enough to see Samuel marry a woman named Grace, a fellow survivor from a different plantation, and long enough to meet her first grandchild. In her final years, she often sat on the porch of their small cabin, her hands working on quilts that she sold at the local market, and she would tell anyone who would listen about that impossible morning. Some people believed her. Others thought time and trauma had distorted her memory. But Samuel always confirmed every detail. He remembered the exact temperature of the air, the color of the sky, the smell of fear mixing with morning dew. He remembered the sound of his own voice breaking as he prayed. He remembered the exact timbre of Thaddeus's laugh. And he remembered, with crystalline clarity, the moment when everything changed. In 1863, when word reached Tennessee that President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, Samuel was 29 years old. He gathered with hundreds of others in the town square to hear the news read aloud. There was celebration, yes, but also confusion and fear. Legal freedom was coming, but what did that mean in practical terms? Samuel understood better than most. He had experienced the gap between legal status and actual freedom. He knew that laws on paper were just the beginning, that the real work was in changing hearts and systems, in building new structures that recognized humanity regardless of skin color. He threw himself into that work, becoming active in freedmen's organizations, teaching others to read and write, helping negotiate labor contracts that wouldn't simply replicate slavery under a different name. The story of that morning in 1856 became something Samuel used strategically when he spoke to groups of newly freed people who were terrified of their new reality. Paralyzed by the enormity of freedom after a lifetime of bondage, he would tell them about kneeling in that courtyard. He would describe the hopelessness of that moment, the certainty that death was coming, and then the impossible reversal. He used it to argue that change was possible, that prayer and action combined could move mountains, that the God he believed in was on the side of the oppressed. When he spoke to white audiences, rare as those occasions were, he used the same story differently. He emphasized Thaddeus's downfall, the swift justice that came for a man who thought himself untouchable. It was a warning wrapped in testimony, a suggestion that systems built on cruelty contained the seeds of their own destruction. Not everyone appreciated Samuel's activism. Tennessee during Reconstruction was a violent place. The Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations terrorized black communities, targeting especially those who were educated, prosperous, or politically active. Samuel received threats. Crosses were burned near his property. Twice, men came in the night. But Samuel had prepared. He had learned to shoot, had organized his neighbors into watch groups, and had connections with Union soldiers still stationed in the area. He survived, but others didn't. Friends disappeared. Churches were burned. Schools were destroyed. The backlash against black freedom was vicious and systematic, designed to restore white supremacy through terror, when law could no longer accomplish it. Through all of this, Samuel's faith remained central to his identity, but it evolved. The simple faith of his childhood, the desperate plea of a terrified boy, matured into something more complex. He grappled with questions that had no easy answers. If God could send soldiers to rescue him in 10 minutes, why didn't God prevent the need for rescue in the first place? Why did children still die in slavery? Why did freedom come with so much violence? Samuel didn't claim to have answers, but he developed a theology of resistance that influenced many in his community. He preached that God worked through human hands, that miracles required participation, that faith without action was empty. He argued that the soldiers came not just because he prayed, but because someone, somewhere, had the courage to report Thaddeus's crimes. Divine intervention and human agency weren't separate, they were intertwined. In 1870, Samuel had an unexpected visitor. A young white man, thin and nervous, appeared at his door, asking for him by name. Samuel was immediately cautious, but the man's demeanor was non-threatening. He introduced himself as Thomas Harrove, Thaddeus's grandson. Thaddeus had died 5 years earlier, and Thomas had been going through his grandfather's papers, trying to understand the family history. He had found records of the arrest, the trial, the conviction. He had also found a journal where Thaddeus had written in his final years about that morning. The old man had become obsessed with it, had written pages trying to understand what had happened, and had convinced himself, in his deteriorating mental state, that Samuel had somehow cursed him, that dark forces had been at work. Thomas wanted to apologize, not just for that specific incident, but for everything his family had done. He offered to sign over a piece of land that had once been part of Willowbrook, a small parcel that had come into his possession. Samuel listened to all of this with a complicated mix of emotions. The apology felt genuine, but it also felt insufficient. No apology could return the years stolen, the trauma inflicted, the lives destroyed. And yet, Thomas was there, trying to make amends in the only way he knew how. Samuel accepted the land, not because he forgave the Harrove family, but because the land itself was innocent and could be used for good. He turned it into a school, one of the first in the region, specifically for black children. He named it Hope Academy, after the commodity that had been most scarce during his childhood. As Samuel aged, people began to seek him out specifically for the story. Journalists, historians, abolitionists collecting narratives. They all wanted to hear firsthand about that impossible morning. Samuel's account remained consistent across decades, which lent it credibility. He never embellished, never added dramatic details, never tried to make himself more heroic than he had been. He was always clear that he had been terrified, that his prayer had been desperate, that he had no idea soldiers were coming. The only miracle he claimed was timing, and even that he held with intellectual humility, always noting that he couldn't prove divine intervention, only that he believed it with his whole heart. In 1885, a photographer traveled to Tennessee specifically to document Samuel and others from his generation who had survived slavery. The resulting photograph is remarkable. Samuel at 41 looked much older, his face lined with experience, his hair already graying, but his eyes were clear, direct, unflinching. Next to him in the photograph stood Grace, his wife, and their 3 children. Behind them, barely visible, was the school he had built. The photograph became somewhat famous, was reprinted in abolitionist literature, and was used to argue for continued support for freedmen's programs. Samuel received no money from this, but he didn't mind. He saw the photograph as testimony, as visual proof that the boy who knelt in that courtyard had built a life, had created something lasting. The turn of the century brought new challenges. The initial promise of Reconstruction had failed. Jim Crow laws were systematically stripping away the rights that had been gained. Lynching was epidemic. The Supreme Court had validated, separate but equal, in Plessy v. Ferguson. Samuel watched the progress he had fought for erode, and it broke something in him. He became, in his final years, more militant in his language. He argued that patience had been a mistake, that nonviolence in the face of violence was suicide. He supported armed self-defense and helped organize mutual aid societies that could respond quickly to threats. Some of his former allies, particularly white moderates who had supported gradual change, distanced themselves. But Samuel no longer cared about white comfort. He had spent too many years trying to be palatable, trying to prove black humanity to people determined not to see it. Samuel died in 1898 at the age of 64 from pneumonia. His funeral was attended by hundreds. People traveled from across the South to pay respects. There were speeches, hymns, testimonies. Multiple people told the story of that morning at Willowbrook, each adding their own interpretation, their own meaning. Samuel's children, grown adults with children of their own, listened to these stories about their father's childhood and marveled at the courage it must have taken to survive, to build a life from ashes, to maintain faith through everything he had witnessed. Hope Academy, the school Samuel founded, operated for another 40 years before financial pressures and segregation policies forced its closure. But it educated hundreds of students during its operation, many of whom went on to become teachers, professionals, and activists in their own right. They carried Samuel's story with them, passed it down to their students, to their children. The story evolved with each telling, as stories do. Some versions emphasized the miraculous timing more than others. Some focused on Samuel's courage, others on divine intervention, still others on the importance of federal intervention against state-sanctioned oppression. All versions, however, maintained the core truth. A boy prayed, a master laughed, and 10 minutes later, everything changed. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, Samuel's story experienced a revival. Activists digging through historical archives found accounts of his life, found the photographs, found transcripts of speeches he had given. They recognized in his narrative elements that resonated with their own struggle. The same themes of faith and resistance, the same belief that the impossible could happen. Martin Luther King Jr. never directly referenced Samuel as far as records show, but the theological framework King articulated. The idea that the arc of the moral universe is long but bends toward justice would have been familiar to Samuel. Both men believed that divine justice and human action were partners, that prayer required feet, that faith demanded work. The site where Willowbrook Plantation once stood is now partially a historic marker and partially private property. The marker, erected in 1995, tells a sanitized version of the plantation's history. It mentions that it was a cotton plantation, that it operated from the early 1800s until the Civil War, that it was involved in labor practices typical of the era. Samuel is not mentioned. Martha is not mentioned. The specific events of that November morning are not mentioned. Historians and activists have petitioned for a more honest marker, one that names the atrocities committed there and honors those who suffered. As of now, those petitions have not been successful. The current property owner, a developer planning to build a golf course, has resisted any designation that might complicate his plans. But memory persists in other ways. Samuel's descendants, now numbering in the hundreds, hold reunions every few years. At these gatherings, the story is told again, usually by the eldest members of the family, who heard it from those who heard it from Samuel himself. The details remain remarkably consistent: the dirt courtyard, the cold morning, the prayer, the laugh, the strange feeling in the air, the sound of approaching horses, the soldiers in blue. Younger family members sometimes struggle to reconcile the story with their understanding of how the world works. Some embrace it as literal truth, evidence of divine intervention in their family's history. Others interpret it metaphorically as a story about courage and coincidence that took on spiritual meaning over time. But all recognize its importance, its role in family identity, its testimony to survival. Academic historians have studied Samuel's account extensively. Some have tracked down military records and confirmed that, yes, a detachment of federal soldiers did arrest Thaddeus Harrove on that specific date, that, yes, he was tried and convicted of illegal slave trading, that, yes, his property was confiscated. These facts are documented. What remains debated is the supernatural element. Was the timing truly miraculous? Or was it simply the kind of coincidence that happens more often than we think? Made meaningful by human need for narrative, the debate is probably unresolvable. Miracles, by definition, resist empirical proof. They exist in the space between event and interpretation, between what happened and what it means. What isn't debatable is the impact. Samuel's story, whether miraculous or coincidental, changed lives. It gave hope to people who had every reason to despair. It provided a narrative framework for understanding suffering and liberation. It demonstrated that power, however absolute it appears, is always contingent, always vulnerable to unexpected reversals. It showed that 10 minutes can contain transformations that reshape everything that follows. These truths transcend the question of whether divine intervention literally occurred. They operate on a different level. The level of meaning, making, of story as survival tool, of narrative as resistance. The final word belongs to Samuel himself. In one of the last interviews he gave, conducted in 1895 by a researcher collecting oral histories, Samuel was asked directly, "Do you believe God sent those soldiers?" Samuel's response, preserved in the interviewer's notes, was characteristically thoughtful. He said, "I know I prayed. I know they came. Whether God sent them, or whether my prayer simply gave me the strength to stand up and face whatever came next, I can't say for certain. But I know this faith changes things. Sometimes it changes circumstances. Always it changes the person who has faith. I was a different boy when I stood up than I was when I knelt down. That transformation, That's the miracle I know for sure happened. Everything else, you'll have to decide for yourself. That perspective, humble yet certain, characterized Samuel's entire approach to his own story. He never claimed to have all the answers. He never demanded that others believe exactly as he did. He simply testified to what he had experienced and let people draw their own conclusions. In an era of absolute certainties, of rigid theological systems, of sharp divisions between believers and skeptics, Samuel's nuanced faith was radical. He held divine mystery and human agency in tension, refusing to collapse one into the other, insisting that both were real and important. The impossible happened that morning at Willowbrook Plantation. Whether it was divine intervention, extraordinary coincidence, or some combination of both, something broke through the expected script of oppression. A boy who should have died instead lived. A master who seemed untouchable was brought down. And in that breaking, in that reversal, a story was born that would outlive everyone involved. A story that would travel through generations and would speak to the persistent human need to believe that cruelty doesn't have the final word, that justice exists, even when delayed, that prayers are heard, even when the heavens seem silent. Samuel's story reminds us that history is not inevitable, that the systems that oppress us are not permanent fixtures of reality, but human constructions that can be dismantled. It reminds us that courage sometimes looks like a child on his knees, that faith sometimes sounds like a desperate prayer, that victory sometimes arrives when we've given up expecting it. It reminds us that 10 minutes can change everything, that the impossible happens more often than we think, and that the power of hope is itself a form of resistance against despair. The boy who knelt in that dirt courtyard died an old man, surrounded by family, having built schools and raised children, and told his story 10,000 times. The master who laughed died alone, broken, his empire destroyed, his name a synonym for cruelty and downfall. And in the space between those two deaths, in the decades that separated that morning from their final moments, a different world struggled to be born. That struggle continues. The impossible is still happening, still breaking through, still transforming courtrooms and cotton fields into places where justice makes surprise appearances and laughter turns to ashes. Samuel's story is our story, if we have the courage to claim it, if we have the faith to believe it, if we have the wisdom to learn from it. The echo of the impossible, Samuel's gravestone, in a small, well-kept cemetery in Tennessee, bears a simple inscription: Samuel Freeman, 1844 to 1898. He believed and therefore he spoke. The name, Freeman, was one he chose for himself and his family after the war, a declaration that rang with both truth and aspiration. The epitaph captures the essence of his legacy, a life defined not by passive belief, but by the audacity to give that belief a voice, even when it trembled. In the century that followed his death, the world Samuel knew and helped shape underwent seismic shifts. The two world wars, the Great Migration that saw millions of African Americans leave the South, the long, bloody arc of the civil rights movement culminating in the 1960s. Each era had its own battles, its own oppressors who seemed unmovable, and its own faithful who knelt, spoke, and stood up. Samuel's story, preserved in family lore archival fragments, and that single haunting photograph never faded entirely. It resurfaced in curious ways. In 1955, a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. preached a sermon in Montgomery, Alabama, titled, "When You Stand for the Right, You Never Stand Alone." While he didn't name Samuel, the parallels were striking. He spoke of the moments when history hinges on a single act of faith, when the material world seems to bend to a moral force. Scholars later noted that King's personal library contained a pamphlet of Narratives of Faith and Freedom, which included a condensed version of Samuel's testimony. Whether it directly influenced him is unknown, but the theological kinship was undeniable. In the 1970s, during the Black Power movement and a surge of interest in reclaiming African American history, a graduate student named Angela Blythe wrote her doctoral dissertation on folklore as resistance, the miraculous narrative in slave and post-slave communities. A full chapter was devoted to the Willowbrook incident, as she called it. She tracked down living descendants of other Willowbrook workers, cross-referenced their family stories with military and court records, and treated the account not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a cultural artifact to be understood. Her conclusion was profound. The truth of the Willowbrook story does not reside in its provable sequence of events, but in its undeniable function. For the oppressed, it was a story of divine vindication. For the oppressor, it was a ghost story, a tale of cosmic comeuppance. In both cases, it served as a psychological and social corrective to a system that claimed its power was absolute and natural. It was a crack in the monolith. The land itself, the old Willowbrook soil, had its own story. The developer's golf course project in the late 1990s stalled due to financing, and the property fell into neglect. Local legend, fueled by the story's underground persistence, held that the land was unquiet. Survey crews reported equipment failures near the site of the old courtyard. A historian hired by a preservation society, using old plats and Samuel's descriptions, believed she pinpointed the exact spot where he knelt. She took a soil sample. Laboratory analysis showed unusually high levels of iron and salt. Consistent, she argued in a controversial paper, with decades of blood, sweat, and tears being shed upon it. The ground, it seemed, had indeed remembered. This lore reached a new peak in 2014. A documentary filmmaker, Marcus Thorne, embarked on a project to trace Samuel's lineage and the story's journey. He found Irene Freeman, Samuel's great-great-granddaughter, a history professor in Chicago. In a powerful scene, Thorne interviewed Irene in her office, the 1885 photograph of Samuel on her desk. "Do you believe your great-great-grandfather's prayer caused the soldiers to come?" Thorne asked. Irene smiled, a smile that echoed Samuel's own serene certainty. "I believe his prayer caused him to stand up," she said. "And I believe that 1,000 invisible threads, the courage of whoever informed on Herove, the diligence of some clerk in Washington, the conscience of an army officer, all those threads were woven into the fabric of that moment." Was it a miracle? I think we get hung up on that word. My ancestor called it help, and help came. The mechanism is less important than the outcome, and a child was saved, and a tyrant fell. That's the story we tell. Not to prove a metaphysical point, but to remind ourselves that the weave of history can be torn, and sometimes it's torn by the smallest, weakest hands. The documentary, 10 Minutes in November, aired on public television. It sparked a minor revival. Blogs debated it. Podcasts dissected it. A playwright adapted it into an off-Broadway show that focused on the 10-minute silence between the laugh and the hooves. That charged, transformative pause. Then, in 2020, the story found its way into a very modern forum. During the global protests following the murder of George Floyd, a social media thread went viral. It started with a historian tweeting the 1885 photo of Samuel with the caption, "He knelt." But not in submission. He knelt to pray, and then he stood up. Remember, the posture of prayer can be the prelude to the posture of defiance. The image was shared millions of times, morphing into a digital icon of resilience. Memes place Samuel's determined face alongside modern activists. The phrase, "the Willowbrook 10 minutes," became shorthand for that critical, volatile moment when a situation tips, when despair flips into resolve, when the unimaginable becomes inevitable. This digital resurrection had a tangible effect. A coalition of activists, historians, and Samuel's descendants, empowered by the renewed attention, launched a fresh campaign for the historical marker at Willowbrook. This time, they bypassed the reluctant developer and petitioned the State Historical Commission directly. Armed with documented evidence, Irene's powerful testimony, and thousands of signatures. After a contentious hearing, the commission voted to erect a new marker. It would be placed on the public roadside, acknowledging the full history. The unveiling ceremony was held on a crisp November morning, 164 years to the day after the original event. Descendants of the enslaved and descendants of the Harrove family, including a branch that had long since repudiated their ancestors' legacy, stood together. The new marker read seat here. In 1856, a child named Samuel prayed for mercy. His enslaver, Thaddeus Harrove, laughed. Within minutes, federal soldiers arrived, arresting Harrove for crimes against humanity and initiating freedom for those he held captive. This moment, remembered as a miracle of timing and faith, reminds us that systems of injustice are fragile, and that cries for justice, however faint, echo through time. I was a different boy when I stood up than I was when I knelt down. Samuel Freeman. After the speeches, Irene Freeman stepped forward. She didn't address the crowd. Instead, she turned her back to them and faced the empty, overgrown fields where the courtyard once was. She was silent for a full minute, the crowd hushed behind her. Then she simply said, "Thank you." It was unclear to whom she was speaking. To Samuel, to God, to the anonymous informant, to the very principle of hope itself. Perhaps it was to all of them. The story's final lesson may be this: the impossible is not a singular event that happens and is done. It is a seed. Samuel's 10 minutes planted that seed. It grew in the hard soil of Reconstruction, pushed through the concrete of Jim Crow, and branched out into the civil rights era. Its roots now touch the digital age. The impossible becomes possible when a story is told so often and believed so deeply that it changes the way people see their own agency. Thaddeus Harrove believed in a world of fixed hierarchies, where power was a possession to be wielded. His laughter was the sound of that certainty. Samuel, in his prayer, believed in a world of moral consequence, where unseen forces and human courage could intersect. His silence, then his voice, was the sound of that faith. The hoofbeats that answered were the sound of the collision between those two worlds. We live in that collision still. We still have masters who laugh at vulnerability, who see people as property, be it economic, political, or social. And we still have those who kneel, not in surrender, but to gather their strength, to connect to something beyond the immediate brutality, to pray or protest or prepare. Samuel's story does not promise that cavalry will always crest the hill in the 10th minute. For every Samuel, countless others fell and were forgotten by history. But his story insists that the cavalry can come, that the threads of justice, though often hidden, are being woven, that a prayer and a report and a law and a conscience can, in a specific, fleeting alignment, create a rupture in time. And in that rupture, everything can change. So, the story ends not with an answer, but with an invitation. It invites us to consider our own courtyards, our own moments of kneeling or laughing. It asks us which side of the miracle we choose to be on: the side that laughs at faith, or the side that, through faith, stands up and makes the impossible happen, one 10-minute interval at a time. The boy in the dirt is gone. The master on the porch is gone. But the choice they represent is eternal. And as long as that choice exists, the story, and its power to change the next 10 minutes, is never over.